She's been coming to his grave every Sunday for 3 months, bringing daisies she can't afford, crying until her voice breaks. And he's been watching every single second through hidden cameras, very much alive, learning the truth about who really loved him when he had nothing left to lose. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Lagos, midnight in Chicago, afternoon in London, or evening in Sydney, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Imani Okafor's hands trembled as she placed the daisies on the cold marble headstone, her knees sinking into the dirt despite the fact that she was wearing her only good dress, the black one with the hem that had started a fray 3 weeks ago. The August heat pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake, making sweat bead at her temples and slide down the back of her neck, mixing with the tears that wouldn't stop coming no matter how many times she wiped them away. The wilted petals of last week's flowers still clung to the base of a stone, brown and brittle, and she brushed them aside with fingers that looked too thin, too worn, nails bitten down to nothing from stress she couldn't name. 13 weeks, 91 days. He'd been gone for 91 days, and every single one of them had felt like drowning in slow motion. Her mascara left dark tracks down her brown skin, and she didn't bother wiping them anymore. What was the point? No one was here to see her fall apart. She leaned closer to the headstone, her lips moving in a whisper so quiet that even the wind couldn't carry it away. "I brought your favorite again," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. "Even though you never told me they were your favorite. I just knew." And for a moment, just a flicker of a second, she could see them again, those same daisies in a hospital room 3 years ago, sitting in a plastic vase on a table between them while he laughed at something stupid she'd said. 3 miles away, in a hidden room beneath an industrial building that didn't appear on any public maps, Elias Crane sat forward in his chair, his finger hovering over the screen that showed her face in painful, perfect detail. The underground surveillance room hummed with a quiet buzz of technology, 12 monitors arranged in a semicircle, each one showing different angles of Greystone Cemetery, but his eyes never left the center screen. The one trained on her. His jaw clenched so hard it ached, and his hands gripped the leather armrests until his knuckles went white, the tendons in his forearms standing out like cords. Part of him wanted to run. Part of him wanted to get in his car, drive to that cemetery, and drop to his knees in front of her to beg forgiveness for what he'd done. But the other part, the part that had orchestrated this entire elaborate deception, knew he had to keep watching. He had to see this through. His mind flashed back against his will to that morning 3 months ago, the morning he'd staged his own death. He could still see her face when the doctors had told her he was gone, the way her scream had torn through the hospital corridor like something breaking in half. He'd watched it later on the security footage, watched her try to bring him back for 17 minutes of CPR, her hands covered in his blood, her voice hoarse from screaming his name. And now here he was, watching her grieve a man who wasn't even dead. Imani pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her purse, unfolding it with shaking hands, and began to read aloud to the grave like she was talking to someone who could actually hear her. "Dear Elias," she started, her voice steadier now, like she'd practiced this. "I lost the apartment last week. The landlord said he couldn't wait anymore, and I don't blame him because I'm 3 months behind and drowning in your medical bills from that last hospital stay. Malik's tuition is due in 2 weeks, and I don't have it. I'm working 3 jobs now, double shifts at the diner, overnight cleaning at the office buildings downtown, and weekend shifts at the grocery store, and it's still not enough." Her voice cracked again, and she pressed her palm flat against the stone like she could feel him through it. "You always said I was stronger than I knew. I'm trying to believe you. I'm trying so hard." In the distance, maybe 50 yards away, an elaborate arrangement of white roses sat on another grave, the kind that cost $5,000 and screamed of money that had never known struggle. Vivian Crane's contribution to her brother's memory. Imani had watched her place them there on the day of the funeral, watched her dab at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, watched her leave after 20 minutes and never come back. That had been 13 weeks ago. Imani had come every Sunday since. She was the only one. The security guard's footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind her, and Imani didn't turn around because she knew what he was going to say. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice gentle in that way people used when they were trying not to disturb grief. We close in 15 minutes. She nodded, still not looking at him, her hand still pressed against Elias Nathaniel Crane's name carved into expensive marble. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I just needed more time today. The guard stepped closer, and she could feel his presence beside her, solid and kind. You're the only one who visits anymore, you know, he said, and there was something sad in his voice that made her finally look up at him. The family stopped coming after week 2. All those business people who showed up for the funeral, haven't seen a single one since. Imani's eyes traced the words carved below Elias's name, beloved son, brother, entrepreneur. The stone was cold under her fingertips, unyielding, permanent. Not beloved friend, not beloved anything to me. Because what were we? What do you call someone who became your entire world in 3 years of Wednesday night coffee and late night phone calls and moments that felt like more than friendship but never quite became something else? What do you call the man who knew how you took your coffee and what made you laugh and the exact tone of voice you used when you were about to cry, but who never said the words until it was too late? Imani pushed herself to her feet, her knees aching from kneeling on the hard ground, and brushed the dirt from her dress with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. She turned to leave, took 3 steps, then stopped and looked back one last time at the grave that had become her Sunday ritual, her weekly confession booth, the only place where she could say the things she'd never gotten to say when he was alive. I know you said not to cry for you, she whispered, and the wind carried her words across the empty cemetery. But you were wrong about so many things. 3 miles away, Elias Crane's face transformed from cold observation to something breaking, something raw and bleeding that he hadn't let himself feel in 91 days. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers, typed out a message to his attorney, then deleted it. Typed it again, deleted it again. On the monitor, Imani walked away past rows of graves, her shoulders straight despite everything, her head held high even though he could see from the camera angle that tears were still streaming down her face. He watched her until she disappeared from view, and then he kept watching the empty space where she'd been, his hand frozen over the phone, his chest tight with something that felt like dying all over again. What she doesn't know is that in 48 hours, she'll receive a letter from a dead man's attorney, and her entire life is about to shatter in ways even he didn't predict. If you're already hooked and want to see how this story unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now for Olivia the Storyteller. And if you're the type who watches without subscribing, go ahead and drop in the comments why you're choosing to miss out on stories like this every week. We'll wait. 3 years before Imani would kneel at a grave mourning a man who wasn't dead, she was working the night shift at St. Michael's Hospital, moving through the fluorescent-lit emergency wing with the kind of exhausted competence that came from being in your 3rd year on the job and your 10,000th hour of watching people at their worst. It was 2 a.m, that dead hour when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, and she'd already treated a construction worker with a nail through his hand, a college kid with alcohol poisoning, and a mother who'd driven herself to the ER with appendicitis because she couldn't afford an ambulance. Imani's feet ached in her practical shoes, her scrub smelled like antiseptic and other people's emergencies, and she had 4 more hours until her shift ended and she could go home to her cramped apartment where her 19-year-old brother was probably still awake studying for exams he couldn't afford to fail. She was washing her hands at the nurse's station, thinking about whether she had enough money left this week to buy actual groceries or if it was going to be ramen again, when the ambulance brought him in. Elias Crane, though she didn't know his name yet. She just saw another man in an expensive suit, the kind of designer fabric that probably cost more than her monthly rent, now torn at the shoulder and stained with blood that looked almost black under the harsh lights. Minor injuries from a car accident, the paramedics said, but he was having what looked like a major panic attack, his breathing rapid and shallow, his hands trembling so badly he couldn't sign the intake forms. Her first thought, the one she wasn't proud of later, was here we go. Another rich guy who thinks money can solve everything, probably wants a private room and a doctor who'll kiss his feet. His first thought, though she wouldn't know this until much later, was that she looked at him like he was a person, not a bank account, not an opportunity, not a stepping stone to something better. She cleaned the gash on his forehead with steady hands while he tried to get his breathing under control, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see, somewhere far away from this emergency room that smelled like fear and disinfectant. You're safe, she told him, her voice calm and professional, the same tone she used with everyone from scared children to dying grandmothers. The accident wasn't your fault. The other driver ran a red light. You walked away. That's what matters. He laughed then, but it was a bitter sound, sharp-edged and wrong. I just came from a charity gala, he said, and his voice was rough like he'd been screaming. $5,000 a plate to save the rainforest or feed hungry children, or whatever cause made people feel good about themselves this week. You know how many of those people actually care about the cause. She dabbed at the wound, her movements efficient, not looking at his face. I'm guessing not many. He shook his head, winced when the movement pulled at the cut. They care about being seen caring. They care about the networking opportunities. 3 different people cornered me, tonight, asking for investments in their startups. 2 more wanted me to sit on their boards. One wanted to marry her daughter off to me like this is the 1800s, and I'm shopping for a wife. She finally looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something unexpected in his eyes, genuine exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. Money doesn't buy authenticity, she said, applying a butterfly bandage with careful precision. Sounds like you learned that tonight. His surprise was almost comical, his eyebrows lifting despite the headache she knew he must have. You're very direct. She allowed herself a small smile. I work night shifts in an emergency room. I don't have time for anything else. He studied her face for a long moment, and she could feel the weight of his attention, the way he was looking at her like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. I'm worth $800 million, he said quietly, and she couldn't tell if it was a confession or a warning. I built a tech company from nothing, sold it for more money than I knew existed when I was growing up in rural Kentucky eating government cheese and wondering if we'd lose the trailer. And now I have everything and trust no one. Imani finished bandaging his wound and stepped back, crossing her arms over her chest, meeting his eyes with the kind of honesty that had gotten her in trouble more times than she could count. I grew up in Detroit, she said, her voice steady and sure. My dad worked 3 jobs until his heart gave out when I was 16. My mom died 2 years later from cancer we couldn't afford to treat properly. I'm raising my younger brother on a nurse's salary while drowning in medical school debt I'll probably never pay off. I have nothing and know exactly who my real friends are. She paused, let that sink in, watched something shift in his expression. Want some coffee? The vending machine stuff is terrible, but it's hot and it's free, and misery loves company. For the first time in what must have been months, maybe years, Elias Crane laughed, really laughed, the sound genuine and surprised and almost painful in its unexpectedness. She bought 2 cups of vending machine coffee with quarters scrounged from her pocket, brought them back to his bedside, and handed him one with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for expensive wine. He took a sip and grimaced, his whole face scrunching up in distaste. This is terrible, he said, but he was smiling. She grinned back, feeling something warm unfurl in her chest despite her exhaustion, despite everything. Welcome to how the other half lives. The moment shattered when his sister arrived 40 minutes later, her heels clicking down the hallway like gunshots, her designer handbag probably worth more than Imani's car. Vivian Crane swept into the room with the kind of presence that demanded attention, her blonde hair perfect despite the late hour, her makeup flawless, her entire demeanor screaming old money and new power. She looked at Imani the way you'd look at furniture, something functional but beneath notice, something that existed to serve and then disappear. Are you finished with the help? Vivian asked, not even directing the question at Imani, speaking over her head to her brother like she wasn't standing right there. We have actual doctors waiting to see you. Real doctors, not just nurses. Imani saw Elias's jaw tighten, saw the muscles in his neck go taut, but he didn't correct his sister, didn't defend her, didn't say a single word. And that told her everything she needed to know about how this night would end. She pulled on her professional mask, the one she perfected over 3 years of dealing with people who thought money made them better than her, and kept her voice perfectly neutral. Just keeping your brother alive, ma'am, she said, her tone so polite it could cut glass. I'll leave you to the real doctors. She turned to go, her hand already on the curtain, ready to disappear back into the controlled chaos of the emergency room where at least people were honest about their suffering. But his voice stopped her. What's your name? Elias asked, and there was something urgent in his tone, something that made her turn back despite herself. She met his eyes, saw something there that looked like regret or maybe apology, and decided to give him something real before she walked away forever. "Imani," she said quietly. "It means faith." Then she slipped through the curtain and went back to work, back to saving lives that didn't require her to navigate the complicated politics of wealth and class and people who looked at her like she was less than human. The expensive flowers arrived at the nurse's station 1 week later, a massive arrangement of roses and lilies that made her coworkers whistle and gather around like it was Christmas morning. The card was simple, written in handwriting that looked like it came from someone who'd once been poor enough to appreciate the value of words. "Thank you for the terrible coffee and honest conversation." You see, her coworkers teased her mercilessly, making kissy noises and demanding to know who her secret admirer was, but Imani felt something cold settle in her stomach. She didn't want charity. She didn't want to be someone's guilt-driven good deed, the poor nurse he remembered fondly while he went back to his $800 million life. She threw the flowers away during her break, dumped the whole expensive arrangement in the trash behind the hospital, and told herself that was the end of it. But when her shift ended at 6 in the morning and she walked out to the parking lot with the sunrise painting the sky pink and gold, he was there. Elias Crane, billionaire, looking exhausted and nervous and completely out of place in the employee parking lot, holding 2 cups of vending machine coffee like they were precious artifacts. "I'm not here as a billionaire," he said before she could turn around and leave. "I'm here as someone who'd like a friend." She stood there for a long moment, her keys digging into her palm, her body screaming for sleep, her brain warning her that this was a bad idea, that people like him didn't want friends. They wanted projects, they wanted to feel good about themselves, they wanted something. But there was something in his eyes that looked like the same loneliness she saw in her mirror every morning, and against her better judgment, she said yes. What started as coffee became Wednesday night meetings at diners where they could split the bill. Wednesday nights became daily text messages about nothing and everything. Daily texts became late-night phone calls when neither of them could sleep. And slowly, carefully, 2 people who'd learned not to trust anyone built something neither of them could name. Something real and raw and dangerous. Something his family would spend the next 3 years trying to destroy. Something that would survive even death itself. This is where their story really begins. And if you're not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller, you're about to miss the most heartbreaking part. Hit subscribe now, or tell me in the comments what's stopping you. I'm genuinely curious why you'd skip stories like this. Over the next 18 months, something extraordinary happened in the ordinary spaces where real life exists. Wednesday night coffee at that same diner became sacred, the kind of ritual that neither of them would break for business meetings or family obligations or exhaustion that made their bones ache. They expanded to weekend museum visits where they'd spend hours arguing about modern art neither of them really understood, to walks through public parks where they'd sit on benches and watch people and make up stories about strangers' lives. Imani had one rule from the beginning, delivered with a kind of firmness that told him she'd walk away if he violated it. "No expensive dates," she said that first Wednesday, her finger pointing at him across the scarred diner table. "If we can't split the bill, we're not going. I'm not your charity case, and I'm not interested in your money." And the remarkable thing was that he respected it, truly respected it in a way that surprised them both. Diners where coffee refills were free, and the pie was 2 days old but still good. Street food from vendors who knew them by name. Public parks where admission was free and the only cost was time, which they gave to each other freely, generously, without keeping score. Her coworkers at the hospital started noticing the change in her, the way her smile came easier, the way she hummed sometimes during her shifts, the way she checked her phone during breaks with an expression that looked dangerously close to happy. She hadn't smiled like that in years, not since before her mother died, and the weight of the world landed on her 23-year-old shoulders. But Malik, her younger brother, was suspicious from the start, his 19-year-old cynicism born from watching his sister sacrifice everything while rich people walked past homeless veterans on their way to expensive brunches. "Rich guys don't want friendship," he told her one night while she was getting ready to meet Elias for their Wednesday coffee. "They want to feel good about themselves. They want a project. And when they get bored, they disappear." Elias's 42nd birthday fell on a Thursday, which many had to suffer through the family dinner at Le Bernardin, the kind of exclusive restaurant where reservations were made 6 months in advance, and the cheapest bottle of wine cost more than Imani made in a week. His mother Dorothy sat at the head of the table, 72 years old and still sharp as a knife, her pearls glowing under the candlelight, her expression carefully neutral in that way that meant she was judging everything and finding it wanting. Vivian raised her glass for a toast, her smile bright and cold and cruel. "To my dear brother," she said, her voice carrying across the private dining room, "who has everything any man could want, success, wealth, influence, and yet insists on spending his time with charity cases. Perhaps this year he'll finally learn that kindness is weakness and sentiment is expensive." The table laughed, that polite laughter that wealthy people use to acknowledge cruelty while pretending it was wit. Preston Ashford, Elias's business partner, and the man who'd helped him build his company from a 3-person startup to a tech empire, leaned forward with his shark smile. "Speaking of expensive," Preston said, swirling his wine, "I've been looking at Helix Tech. They're vulnerable right now, ripe for a hostile takeover. We could absorb them within 6 months, eliminate the competition entirely." Elias felt his jaw tighten, felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes that meant a migraine was coming. "Helix Tech employs 300 people," he said quietly. "A hostile takeover would mean layoffs. Families without income." Preston waved a hand dismissively. "That's business, Elias. You're too soft. Always have been." Dorothy dabbed at her lips with her napkin, her eyes on her son with that calculating look he'd learned to dread. "When will you settle down with someone from our circle?" she asked, her tone making it clear this wasn't really a question. "Vivian has introduced you to 6 suitable women. The Pemberton girl would make an excellent wife, good breeding, old money, understands how our world works." Elias felt his phone buzz in his pocket and couldn't help checking it under the table. Imani's text was simple. "Hope your fancy birthday dinner doesn't make you forget about us regular people." Wednesday still on. He smiled despite himself, felt something warm unfurl in his chest that had nothing to do with the expensive wine. Vivian's eyes were on him, sharp and knowing and dangerous. "Who's distracting you?" she asked, her voice deceptively sweet. "That nurse, the one who thinks she's too good for flowers." His defensive response came too quickly, too forcefully. "Her name is Imani, and she's my friend. Leave her alone." The table went quiet, that particular silence that meant he'd revealed something he shouldn't have, given them ammunition they'd use later. Vivian smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who just spotted prey. 2 weeks later, Elias stood in Imani's apartment for the first time, and felt something shift in his understanding of what mattered in the world. The space was cramped, maybe 500 square feet if you were being generous, but it was clean and full of life in a way his penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture, had never been. Books stacked on every surface, plants on the windowsill catching the afternoon sun, photos of her and Malik at various ages stuck to the refrigerator with magnets from places they'd probably never been. She'd made him promise before he came over, her voice serious and her eyes searching his face. "Don't try to fix anything. Don't offer to pay for anything. Don't look at my life like it's a problem you need to solve." He'd promised, and he meant it. She cooked dinner while he sat at her tiny kitchen table, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she boiled pasta and heated sauce from a jar and poured cheap wine into mismatched glasses. "This is the only place I feel real," he confessed, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Everything else is performance. But here, with you, I can just be myself." She turned from the stove, her expression softening, and began to tell him things she'd never told anyone. About her father working himself to death, taking on extra shifts and extra jobs until his heart simply gave out at 47. About her mother refusing treatment for her cancer because the debt would crush them, choosing to die rather than leave her children with bills they'd never escape. About raising Malik from 16 years old, becoming mother and sister and provider, putting her own dreams of medical school on hold forever so he could have a chance at something better. They reached for the same wine glass at the same moment, their hands touching, and the world seemed to stop spinning for just a second. The air between them changed, charged with something electric and terrifying, and they both felt it, that pull toward something more, something deeper, something that would change everything. But they pulled back, both of them, an unspoken agreement passing between them that this friendship was too precious to risk, too rare to gamble with attraction or romance or any of the things that ruined good things. What Elias didn't tell her that night was that his business partner had already discovered evidence of his own crimes. Preston Ashford had been embezzling funds for 2 years, moving money through shell companies and offshore accounts, covering his tracks with the kind of sophisticated deception that took planning and patience and absolute moral bankruptcy. Elias had found the evidence 3 days earlier, spent 72 sleepless hours tracing every transaction, building a case that would send Preston to prison for decades. He planned to go to the authorities, to expose everything, to do the right thing the way he always tried to do the right thing. But then Preston had called him, his voice calm and friendly, and threatening in a way that made Elias's blood run cold. "I know about the nurse," Preston had said, and Elias could hear the smile in his voice. Imani Okafor, 28 years old, lives at 2847 Fletcher Street, works night shifts at St. Michael's, has a brother named Malik attending community college. She takes the bus to work, walks home alone at 2 in the morning through neighborhoods where people disappear. Such a dangerous world we live in. The threat was clear, crystal clear, sharp as broken glass. Destroy me and I destroy her. Elias hired a private investigator that night, learned within 48 hours that Preston had been tracking Imani for months, had photos of her daily routines, knew her schedule better than she did. His business partner had turned her into leverage without her ever knowing she was in danger, had weaponized Elias's one real friendship to ensure his own protection. The fear that settled into Elias's chest was unlike anything he'd felt before, sharper than business failures or family disappointments or any of the normal fears that plagued wealthy men. He put her in danger just by caring about her. His presence in her life had painted a target on her back. And the only way to protect her was to make Preston believe she didn't matter anymore, to create distance, so complete that she'd no longer be useful as leverage. He canceled Wednesday coffee via text, his fingers shaking as he typed the words. Something came up. Can't make it tonight. The following Wednesday, swamped with work. Rain check. The next, family emergency. Sorry. Each cancellation felt like cutting off a piece of himself, and her responses grew shorter, more confused, tinged with hurt she was trying to hide. Is everything okay? Did I do something wrong? Just tell me if you need space. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to explain that this distance was protection, not rejection, that every ignored text was him choosing her safety over his happiness. But telling her would make her a target again, would give her information that Preston could extract with threats or violence or any of the tools that men like him kept sharp and ready. 3 months passed like slow torture. Imani respected his boundary because that's who she was, someone who understood that people needed space sometimes, who didn't push or demand or make his silence about her. But her internal pain was visible to anyone who knew where to look, the way her smile faded back to the exhausted professionalism she'd worn before they met, the way she stopped humming during her shifts, the way she checked her phone less, and less until she finally stopped checking it at all. She told Ramona, her closest friend at the hospital, that she'd lost her best friend and didn't even know why. Maybe Malik was right, she said, staring at her cold coffee during a break. Maybe rich guys don't really do friendship. Meanwhile, Preston's schemes were deepening like roots pushing through concrete, finding every crack and exploiting every weakness. But what Preston didn't know was that Vivian had discovered his embezzlement too, had found the evidence the same way Elias had, and instead of being horrified, she'd seen opportunity. 2 weeks after Elias started ghosting Imani, Vivian called her brother's business partner to a private meeting at a restaurant Preston couldn't afford on his legitimate salary. "I know what you've been doing," she'd said, sliding a folder across the table. "And I don't care. In fact, I think we can help each other." The alliance formed that night was built on mutual greed and shared contempt for the man they were supposed to love and support. If Elias wouldn't play their game, if he insisted on his moral high ground and his friendship with nurses, and his refusal to crush competitors who stood in their way, then they'd simply remove him from the equation. Dorothy, when they brought her into the conspiracy, had sipped her tea and nodded like they were discussing dinner plans. He was always too sensitive, she'd said. Too much like his father. Weakness. The plan took 2 months to implement. required careful acquisition of substances that wouldn't show up in standard toxicology screens, slow-acting poisons that would look like natural organ failure. And then one night, 47 days after Elias had canceled his last Wednesday coffee with Imani, he collapsed in his office with symptoms the doctors couldn't explain. When the ambulance brought him to St. Michael's Hospital, when they admitted him to room 447 with a prognosis that made the attending physician shake his head, Elias made one request that surprised everyone. The only person he asked for was Imani. She came despite everything, despite 3 months of silence, despite the hurt she'd carefully locked away. Because when someone you love is dying, you don't let pride or pain or confusion stop you from being there. And at 3 a.m. in that hospital room that smelled like fear and failing bodies, he was going to tell her 3 words that would haunt her for years, 3 words that would survive his death and her grief and every lie that followed. In 12 hours, he'd be declared dead, his heart stopping at 6:47 in the morning while she screamed and begged and tried to bring him back with her own hands. But first, he was going to tell her the truth about how he felt, even if it was 3 months too late. We're building to something massive here. If you're not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller yet, you're literally choosing to miss the climax of the story. Subscribe now, or drop a comment explaining why you're okay with that. Seriously, I want to understand. When Imani walked into room 447 at 3 a.m, she almost didn't recognize the man in the bed. Elias looked worse than he had on that night 3 years ago when the ambulance had brought him in after the car accident, worse than she'd ever seen any patient look who wasn't actively dying. His skin had a grayish pallor that made her nurse's instincts scream warnings her brain didn't want to hear. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull like he'd lost 20 pounds in the 47 days since she'd last seen him, and his hands trembled against the white hospital sheets with a tremor that spoke of neurological damage or toxicity or something the doctors clearly couldn't identify. She'd read his chart before coming in, had called in favors to get access to medical records that technically weren't hers to see, and what she'd found had made her blood run cold. The symptoms suggested poisoning, something systemic and deliberate, but every toxicology screen had come back clean. The attending physicians were baffled, running tests for rare autoimmune disorders and exotic infections, and anything that might explain why a healthy 42-year-old man was deteriorating this rapidly. But Imani's instincts, honed by 3 years of night shifts and 10,000 emergencies, told her something the tests couldn't prove. This wasn't illness. This was murder in slow motion. He saw her standing in the doorway, and his whole face transformed, relief flooding through the pain and exhaustion in a way that made her chest ache. "You came," he whispered, his voice hoarse like he'd been screaming or crying or both. She crossed the room and took his trembling hand in both of hers, feeling how cold his skin was, how weak his grip had become. "You asked," she said simply, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. "I'll always come." His confession spilled out in fragments, words tumbling over each other in his urgency to explain everything before time ran out. "I've been a coward," he started, his eyes searching her face like he was memorizing it, like he knew he wouldn't get another chance. The distance, the canceled coffee, the ignored texts, none of it was about you. I was protecting you. Her hand tightened on his, confusion and hurt, and something like hope warring in her expression. Protecting me from what? He told her then, told her everything he could without putting her in more danger. Someone was targeting him, he explained. Someone close enough to know his routines and his vulnerabilities and exactly how to hurt him. He didn't know who. Didn't know if it was Preston with his embezzlement schemes, or Vivian with her cold ambition, or some enemy from his business dealings, or all of them working together in conspiracy. What he did know was that his family wanted him compliant, wanted him to be the kind of ruthless businessman who crushed competitors and maximized profits, and didn't waste time on friendships with nurses who had nothing to offer in return. And Preston wanted him gone entirely, wanted control of the company they built together, wanted Elias's shares and his decision-making power and his inconvenient conscience eliminated. "Everyone in my life wants something from me," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Money or influence or connections or compliance. Everyone except you." The tears came then, sliding down Imani's face in hot tracks that she didn't bother wiping away. "You're my best friend," she said, her voice breaking. "You were protecting me by pushing me away, by making me think I'd done something wrong. By making me think you didn't care anymore. He pulled her hand to his chest, pressed it against his heart that was beating too fast and too irregular, and said the words he should have said 18 months ago when they'd almost kissed in her cramped apartment over cheap wine and simple pasta. It stopped being friendship for me a long time ago, he confessed, his eyes never leaving hers. Maybe it was never just friendship. Maybe from that first night when you brought me terrible vending machine coffee and looked at me like I was a person instead of a bank account. I was already falling. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the time they'd wasted, all the moments they'd pulled back from. I love you, Imani, he said, and it wasn't a declaration or a request or anything romantic. It was just truth, simple and devastating and 3 months too late. Her shock lasted maybe 3 seconds before her own truth came spilling out, the thing she'd been afraid to admit even to herself. I love you too, she whispered, and then she was crying harder, ugly crying, the kind of tears that came from the bottom of your soul. God, Elias, I love you too. They held hands like teenagers, both crying, suspended in a moment that felt like it could shatter at any second. And then he ruined it, the way she somehow knew he would, by saying the words that would haunt her forever. Which is why I need you to promise me something. She shook her head before he even finished the sentence, already knowing what he was going to ask, already preparing to refuse. If I die, and I might, don't cry for me. Live your life. Be happy. Find someone who can give you everything you deserve instead of putting you in danger just by caring about you. Her protest was immediate and fierce. You're not dying. You're 42, you're strong. You've survived everything life has thrown at you. We're going to figure out what's wrong and fix it, and then we're going to have that conversation we've been avoiding for 3 years. But his grip on her hand was insistent, desperate. Promise me. No tears. Promise me you'll live. She promised, even though they both knew it was a lie, even though they both knew that if he died she'd cry until she couldn't breathe. They spent the next 3 hours talking about everything and nothing, the way you do when you know time is running out. He told her about growing up in Kentucky in a trailer that leaked when it rained, about his father who died when he was 12, about building his first computer from parts he'd salvaged from a junkyard. She told him about her mother's last days, about the moment she decided to drop out of medical school to take care of Malik, about the recurring dream she had where she was drowning and no one could hear her calling for help. They talked about the stupid things that had made them laugh during their Wednesday night coffees, about the museum guard who'd caught them making fun of modern art, about the time Elias had tried street tacos and discovered he couldn't handle spice and had spent 10 minutes chugging water while she laughed until she couldn't breathe. Dawn broke through the hospital window, painting the room in shades of pink and gold that felt cruelly beautiful given what was happening. His energy was fading, his words starting to slur, his eyes struggling to focus. And then his heart rate monitor started screaming, that high-pitched alarm that every nurse knows means someone is dying, means you have seconds to act, means everything is about to go wrong. Imani was calling for doctors before his eyes rolled back, was already starting chest compressions by the time the code team burst through the door. Her hands were covered in his blood from the 4 she'd ripped out in her panic. Her voice was hoarse from screaming instructions at people who were supposed to be better at this than her, but who seemed to be moving in slow motion. 17 minutes. That's how long they worked on him, how long she refused to let him go, how long she kept trying to bring him back, even when the doctors were shaking their heads, even when she could see in their faces that it was over. The attending physician, a man 20 years her senior with gray in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes, finally put his hand on her shoulder. Time of death, he said quietly, glancing at his watch. 6:47 a.m. Imani's scream was the sound of something breaking permanently, a sound no one in that hospital would ever forget. She fought the security guards who tried to pull her away from his body, fought them with everything she had, scratching and kicking and sobbing that they had to keep trying, that she could still save him, that he couldn't be gone. They had to physically carry her out of the room, had to hold her in the hallway while she collapsed against the wall and cried until she vomited, until there was nothing left inside her but emptiness and disbelief. Vivian arrived within the hour, moving through the hospital with cold efficiency, her eyes dry, her manner businesslike as she discussed organ donation and funeral arrangements and estate matters with the hospital administrators. Preston showed up 30 minutes after that, his face arranged in an expression of grief that didn't quite reach his eyes, his satisfaction, so poorly concealed that even the doctors noticed. Dorothy arrived last, her pearls perfect, her makeup flawless, her voice steady as she told the grieving staff that her son had always been too sensitive, that perhaps this was for the best, that at least he was at peace now. The funeral was arranged within hours, the kind of efficient processing that money could buy, everything handled before Imani even made it home to her apartment, where Malik found her sitting on the bathroom floor, still covered in Elias's blood. What Imani didn't see, because she was too broken to notice, and because the conspiracy was too well planned, was Elias's body being moved in the middle of the night to a private facility that wasn't on any hospital records. What she didn't know was that the backup plan he'd arranged 3 weeks earlier had been activated the moment his heart stopped, that Augustus Lyle, the one attorney he trusted with the truth, had set everything in motion. 2 doctors had been paid off, a death certificate had been expertly forged, and a plan that had seemed impossible became reality. In a hidden facility 20 miles outside the city, Elias Crane woke up gasping, his chest aching from the drugs that had simulated cardiac arrest, his mind fuzzy from sedatives, his first words a desperate question. "Did she see?" Augustus stood beside the bed, his expression grave. "She tried to bring you back for 17 minutes, he reported quietly. "She wouldn't let go. Security had to carry her out." Something broke in Elias's face then, some fundamental piece of him shattering beyond repair. "Keep me updated on everything," he said, his voice raw. "Everything she does, everywhere she goes, everyone she talks to. I need to know she's safe. I need to know she's surviving this. From the grave he'd just escaped, he was going to watch her grieve, watch her suffer, watch her life fall apart under the weight of loss and lies. He was going to discover his family's secrets through surveillance and investigation, was going to learn that the poison in his system had come from his own sister and business partner and mother working in concert. He was going to document every crime, gather every piece of evidence, build a case that would destroy them all. But first, for the next 13 weeks, he was going to watch the woman he loved cry for a man who wasn't dead, and it was going to hurt worse than any poison they'd put in his body. This is exactly halfway through the story, and if you're still not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller, I genuinely don't understand what you're waiting for. Hit that button, or let me know in the comments why you're choosing to miss out on the resolution, because it's about to get intense. The funeral was held on a Tuesday afternoon at Greystone Cemetery, and 200 people showed up to mourn a man that maybe 3 of them had actually known. The expensive casket gleamed under the late summer sun, surrounded by flower arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the attendees were mostly business associates who checked their phones during the service and discussed stock portfolios in hushed voices while the minister delivered generic platitudes about a life well lived and a soul at peace. Imani stood at the very back of the gathered crowd, as far from the family section as geography would allow, because she couldn't afford a front-row seat among people who wore their wealth like armor and looked at her like she was crashing a party she'd never been invited to in the first place. She wore the same black dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral 6 years ago, the one with the fraying hem and the small stain near the waist that she tried to cover with a cardigan despite the oppressive heat. Vivian delivered the eulogy with perfect posture and precisely calculated tears that appeared on cue and disappeared just as quickly, her words so generic they could have been about anyone. "My brother was a visionary, a leader, a man who touched so many lives," she said, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "He will be remembered for his contributions to technology, his business acumen, and his generous spirit." Imani wanted to scream that Vivian was talking about a stranger, that she just described a LinkedIn profile instead of a human being, that she hadn't mentioned how Elias laughed at stupid jokes, or how he hated expensive restaurants, or how he'd spent 3 years learning to be vulnerable with someone who had nothing to offer him but honesty. Preston Ashford gave the next speech, and it was so opportunistic that several people in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable glances. He pivoted seamlessly from remembering Elias to discussing the company's future leadership structure, essentially announcing his own promotion at his partner's funeral. Dorothy sat in the front row with her spine straight and her face composed, already discussing estate division with the family attorney in whispers that carried farther than she realized. Imani watched them all and understood with perfect clarity that none of them had really known him, that they'd loved the idea of Elias Crane, successful, wealthy, useful, but had never actually loved the man himself. 20 miles away in his hidden facility, Elias watched the funeral through 6 different camera angles, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair hard enough to leave marks in the leather. The rage that built in his chest was unlike anything he'd experienced before, hot and visceral and consuming. He watched his sister fake grief she didn't feel, watched his business partner treat his funeral like a networking opportunity, watched his mother discuss his estate with the emotional investment of someone reviewing a stock portfolio. They weren't mourning him. They were celebrating. Augustus provided running surveillance reports throughout the day, his voice carefully neutral as he relayed information that made Elias's blood boil. Preston had met with Vivian at an upscale bar 3 hours after the funeral, both of them toasting with expensive champagne. The conversation, captured on audio surveillance, had been about splitting company assets and forging documents to transfer stock ownership. Dorothy had joined them for dinner, her contribution to the conspiracy delivered in her refined accent over filet mignon. "He was always too soft," she'd said, cutting into her steak with surgical precision. "Too sentimental. Too concerned with being good instead of being successful. Perhaps this is for the best." That night, security footage from Preston's penthouse showed him hosting a small gathering, his closest associates and his mistress all raising glasses in a toast. The audio was crystal clear, preserved forever in digital format that would eventually be used as evidence. "To freedom," Preston had said, his smile wide and genuine in a way it never was when Elias had been alive. "To new beginnings and the end of moral complications." 1 week later, on the first Sunday after the funeral, Imani made her first trip back to Greystone Cemetery. She bought the daisies from the corner store on the way, the cheapest bouquet they had at $4.99, which was half her weekly grocery budget but felt like the least she could do. The flowers were already wilting in the heat by the time she reached his grave, their white petals browning at the edges, but she placed them carefully at the base of the headstone anyway and knelt in the grass that was still soft from recent rain. Her confession came in fragments, words she'd been holding inside all week spilling out to a piece of carved marble that couldn't judge her or offer advice or tell her she was being dramatic. She told the grave about losing her apartment, about the eviction notice that had been taped to her door 3 days ago, about the landlord who'd been sympathetic but firm about needing the back rent she couldn't pay. She talked about the guilt that consumed her, the feeling that she should have seen that he was being poisoned, that her medical training should have helped her save him instead of watching helplessly while he died. "I broke my promise," she whispered, tears streaming down her face in tracks that caught the afternoon sunlight. "You asked me not to cry and I can't stop crying. I can't stop thinking about what I could have done differently, what I should have noticed, how I failed you when you needed me most." But then she did something that surprised even herself. She started telling him stories, recounting memories from their 3 years of friendship like he could still hear her. She laughed through her tears, remembering the time he tried to impress her by cooking dinner at his place and had set off the smoke alarm making pasta, the way he looked so embarrassed standing there in his expensive kitchen surrounded by evidence of his incompetence. She told him about Malik asking what he should do with his life now that his college fund was gone, about Ramona bringing her groceries she hadn't asked for but desperately needed, about the small kindnesses that made survival possible. In his hidden facility, Elias watched and for the first time truly understood the depth of what he'd done to her. This wasn't performative grief for the cameras or social media posts about loss or any of the theatrical mourning he'd witnessed from his family. This was real, raw, devastating love, and he was watching it destroy her in real time. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice breaking. Over the following weeks, Imani established a routine that became as fixed as her work schedule. Every Sunday at 3 in the afternoon, she took 2 buses to Greystone Cemetery, brought daisies from the corner store, and spent an hour talking to a man who couldn't answer. Week 2, she told the grave about Malik's scholarship rejection, how they'd cited insufficient funds and suggested he take a year off to work and reapply. Her voice was steady when she explained that she'd picked up a 3rd job cleaning offices overnight, that she was sleeping 4 hours a night, that she was doing everything she could to keep her promise to their dead parents that Malik would finish school. Week 3, she shared that she was working triple shifts, her body running on coffee and determination and the kind of exhaustion that made everything feel slightly unreal. She told him about the mistakes she was starting to make at work, The way her hands shook during procedures, the attending physician who'd pulled her aside to ask if she needed to take some time off. Week 4. She brought him updates like he was still listening, like their Wednesday coffee dates had just changed location to a cemetery instead of ending altogether. She told him about a patient who reminded her of him, about a sunset she'd seen that he would have liked, about the small moments of beauty that punctuated the grief. Other mourners stopped coming as the weeks progressed. The family disappeared after week 1, their obligatory visits completed. Business associates made it 2 weeks before deciding they'd paid sufficient respects. But Imani kept coming, faithful as sunrise, and the cemetery guard started recognizing her, would wave as she walked past his station. "You really cared about him," the guard said one Sunday, his voice gentle. "Most people, they visit once or twice, and then life moves on. But you keep showing up." Elias's investigation was deepening like roots pushing through concrete, finding every crack and exploiting every weakness in the conspiracy that had tried to kill him. Augustus had hired a team of forensic accountants, digital specialists, and private investigators who worked with the efficiency of people being paid extremely well to uncover crimes. The paper trail of the poisoning emerged slowly but definitively. Preston had ordered the slow-acting toxin through a contact in Eastern Europe, had paid for it using cryptocurrency that he thought was untraceable but wasn't. The poison had been added to Elias's vitamin supplements, the ones he took every morning with breakfast, a dose so small that it wouldn't show up in standard toxicology screens but would accumulate over time until his organs started failing. Vivian had known about Preston's plan within a week of its implementation, had discovered evidence of the purchase, and instead of warning her brother or going to the police, had seen an opportunity. She'd met with Preston to negotiate her silence in exchange for a share of the company assets and a promise that she'd inherit their mother's estate when Dorothy eventually died. Dorothy had been the last to find out, but had been the most chilling in her complicity. When presented with evidence that both her children were involved in a murder conspiracy, one as perpetrator and one as accessory, she considered the information for exactly 48 hours before making her choice. Money over morality, profit over family. "He was always too soft," she told Vivian over lunch at her country club. "Perhaps this is for the best." Elias's determination to destroy them all was absolute and unwavering, but watching Imani's weekly grief was consuming him with guilt that felt like its own kind of poison. The internal debate raged every single day. Reveal himself now and risk the entire investigation falling apart, or complete the plan and watch her suffer for another month. He kept choosing the plan, kept choosing the long game, kept telling himself that justice was worth her pain. "One more month," he told Augustus in week 4. "One more month to gather the last pieces of evidence, and then I'll tell her everything." But in 3 days, Imani was going to lose her job because of lies Preston had spread through the hospital administration, and Elias was going to have to decide if his protection was worth her suffering, if his plan for justice was more important than her immediate survival, if watching the woman he loved lose everything was a price he was actually willing to pay. If you've made it this far without subscribing to Olivia the Storyteller, I have to ask, what would it take? Because this story is only getting more intense, and you're going to kick yourself if you miss what happens next. Subscribe now, or tell me why not in the comments. 3 days after her 4th Sunday visit to the grave, Imani was called into her supervisor's office at St. Michael's Hospital, and she knew before she even sat down that her life was about to get worse. Linda Chen, the nursing director who'd always been fair and who'd mentored Imani through her first year on night shift, couldn't meet her eyes as she slid a folder across the desk with hands that trembled slightly. "I need you to understand that I don't want to do this," Linda said, her voice tight with something that sounded like guilt or maybe fear. "But the hospital board has left me no choice." The accusation was typed out in clinical language that made it sound official and damning. Imani Okafor was suspected of stealing medications from the pharmacy, specifically controlled substances including morphine and oxycodone. The evidence was security footage from 3 separate occasions showing her accessing the medication storage system outside of patient care hours, taking vials that weren't logged to any patient on her floor, and leaving the hospital with substances that never appeared in any official records. Imani's denial was immediate and visceral, her whole body reacting to the lie like it was a physical blow. "I would never," she started, her voice rising with panic and disbelief. Linda, you know me. I would never steal medications. I don't even take aspirin without documenting it. This is insane. But Linda was already shaking her head, was already pushing forward the termination papers, was already explaining that the hospital board had been pressured by someone with significant influence and deep pockets to make an example of this case. Preston Ashford's invisible hand, though Linda didn't say his name, though she probably didn't even know whose influence was destroying Imani's career. The termination was immediate and brutal. Security was called to escort her out, to watch while she cleaned out her locker, to walk her through the hallways where her co-workers stopped and stared and whispered behind their hands. Her nursing license was under review pending investigation. Her reputation, built over 3 years of competent care and extra shifts and genuine compassion for her patients, was destroyed in the time it took to walk from Linda's office to the parking lot. The shame was suffocating, made worse by the fact that she could see the doubt in people's faces, could see them wondering if maybe the accusation was true, if maybe they'd never really known her at all. 20 miles away, Elias Crane watched the live feed from hospital cameras and felt fury build in his chest until he thought his heart might actually stop again, this time for real. His surveillance team had been tracking Preston's movements for weeks, had documented every meeting and every phone call and every digital footprint, and they'd seen this coming 48 hours ago when Preston had met with a tech specialist who dealt in video manipulation. The accusation was entirely fabricated, the evidence completely doctored, and Preston's motivation was crystal clear from the text he'd sent to Vivian immediately after Imani's termination became official. "Tying up loose ends," the message read, accompanied by a champagne emoji. "Eliminating your brother's weakness, even from beyond the grave. She'll be homeless within a month." Elias's hand slammed down on his desk with enough force to make the monitors shake, his control fracturing in a way it hadn't since this whole nightmare had begun. Augustus stood beside him, his expression grave, his next words carefully measured. "Sir, we can intervene. I can have attorneys at that hospital within the hour. We can expose the doctored footage, clear her name, have Preston arrested for fraud and defamation." But Elias shook his head, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, his eyes never leaving the screen that showed Imani walking to her car alone. "Not yet," he forced out through gritted teeth. "If we intervene now, Preston will know I'm alive. He'll destroy evidence. He'll run, and Vivian and Dorothy will scatter like roaches when the lights come on. I need all of them exposed, not just arrested. I need a case so airtight that they'll spend decades in prison, not just years." Augustus's silence spoke volumes about what he thought of that decision, but he was too professional to argue. Malik found his sister 2 hours later, curled up on the bathroom floor of their apartment, sobbing so hard she couldn't catch her breath. He was 19 years old and had seen his sister cry exactly 3 times in his life. At their father's funeral, at their mother's funeral, and the day Elias Crane had died, but this was different. This was the sound of someone breaking in real time, the kind of crying that came from losing everything and having nothing left to hold on to. The bills were piled on the kitchen table like an indictment of every choice she'd made. $4,000 in back rent, eviction proceedings already started. $8,000 in medical debt from the treatments their mother had refused but that Imani had insisted on anyway, knowing it would bury them financially but unable to watch her mother die without trying everything. Collection notices in angry red envelopes. Final warnings from utility companies. Malik's tuition bill, marked past due, with a note about suspension if payment wasn't received within 2 weeks. He sat beside her on the bathroom floor and offered the only thing he could think of. "I'll drop out," he said quietly. "I'll drop out of school, get a full-time job, help with the bills." Her refusal was immediate and fierce despite her tears. "You're finishing school," she said, her voice raw but absolute. "That's not negotiable. I'll figure something out." But even as she said it, the phone started ringing, a cascade of calls that felt like the universe piling on. The landlord, apologetic but firm about the eviction notice. A debt collector, threatening legal action with the casual cruelty of someone who made their living off other people's desperation. And then a third call from a blocked number, someone who didn't speak, who just breathed into the phone for 10 seconds before hanging up. What Imani didn't know was that the blocked number was Preston's private investigator, checking to make sure she was sufficiently destroyed, confirming that she was isolated and vulnerable and exactly where Preston wanted her. Her friends from the hospital had stopped calling, stopped answering her texts, too worried about their own reputations to associate with someone accused of stealing medications. Her isolation was complete and carefully orchestrated, and she'd never felt more alone in her entire life. Sunday came anyway, indifferent to her suffering, and Imani dragged herself to Greystone Cemetery despite everything, despite the fact that she could barely afford the bus fare, let alone the $4.99 for daisies. She knelt at the grave, and the words that came out were different this time, rawer and more desperate than her previous visits. "I lost my job," she told the marble headstone, her voice breaking on every other word. "They accused me of stealing medications. My nursing license is under review. Everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, wishing she could feel him through it, wishing he could tell her what to do the way he always had during their Wednesday night conversations. "I don't even know why I'm here," she continued, the tears streaming down her face, hot against her skin. "You're gone and my life is imploding, and I keep coming to talk to a grave like you can somehow hear me, like you can somehow help me from wherever you are." And then the words that cut deepest, the self-doubt that had been building since the day he died. Maybe they were right about me. Maybe I was just the nurse who fell for her patient. Maybe I was stupid to think we were really friends, that someone like you could actually care about someone like me. In his hidden facility, Elias couldn't breathe, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles went white, his whole body rigid with pain that had nothing to do with the poison his family had given him. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the screens that showed her breaking down. "God, Imani, I'm so sorry." The breaking point came that night when Augustus presented the final evidence package, hundreds of pages of documentation and digital evidence that proved every single crime Preston, Vivian, and Dorothy had committed. The poisoning, the embezzlement, the conspiracy, the doctored footage that destroyed Imani's career, all of it documented with the kind of thoroughness that would make prosecutors weep with joy. "The police were ready to move," Augustus explained, just waiting for Elias's word to execute arrest warrants that had already been prepared and approved by a judge who'd reviewed the evidence and called it the most clear-cut conspiracy case he'd seen in 30 years. Elias's demand was immediate and non-negotiable. "I want them arrested publicly," he said, his voice cold as winter. "Maximum humiliation. I want cameras. I want their faces on every news channel. I want the whole world to see exactly what they are." But then he paused, his hand hovering over the phone, his next words coming slower. "First, I need to do something." The anonymous payments went out within the hour, untraceable electronic transfers that would take forensic accountants months to track back to their source. Imani's rent was covered for 6 months, paid directly to her landlord with a note claiming it was a settlement from a previous tenant dispute. An anonymous tip went to the nursing board, complete with evidence proving the security footage was doctored, analysis from 3 independent experts confirming digital manipulation, and testimony from hospital staff members who'd been paid to stay quiet. Malik's scholarship fund received a donation with a note saying it was from a memorial fund established in Elias Crane's name for students who'd lost parents to medical debt. Augustus watched his client work and delivered his warning in the same neutral tone he'd used for everything else. "She'll figure it out," he said quietly. "She's not stupid. The timing is too convenient, the amounts too specific. She'll know someone's protecting her, and there's only one person who cared enough to know these exact numbers." Elias nodded, accepting the risk, accepting that his cover might be blown before he was ready. "I don't care," he said, and meant it. "Let her figure it out. I'm not watching her suffer anymore." In 48 hours, she was going to receive a letter from his attorney requesting her presence at a meeting to discuss Elias Crane's final wishes and estate matters. The dead man's instructions would change everything, would set in motion a revelation that would shatter what remained of her understanding of the last 3 months. But first, Preston Ashford was going to make one last move, one final attempt to eliminate Elias's weakness permanently, and that move was going to involve a dark parking lot, a hired thug with a knife, and a confrontation that would almost cost Imani her life. We're entering the most dangerous part of the story. If you haven't subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller yet, this is your last warning. You're about to miss the moment everything changes. Subscribe now, or forever wonder what happened next. Your choice. Drop a comment if you're choosing to skip it. It was 11:30 at night when Imani finally finished her shift cleaning office buildings downtown, her second job since losing her nursing position, her body aching from 6 hours of mopping floors and scrubbing toilets in empty corporate spaces where people made more in a day than she made in a month. The parking garage was nearly empty at this hour, just a few scattered cars belonging to other night shift workers and the security guard who was probably asleep at a station 3 floors up. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that moved and shifted in ways that made her walk faster, her keys already clutched between her fingers the way her father had taught her when she was 16 and started taking night shifts at the hospital. She heard the footsteps behind her when she was maybe 20 feet from her car, heavy boots on concrete echoing in the cavernous space, and her first instinct was to run, but her exhausted body couldn't move fast enough. The man was on her before she could scream, his hand clamping over her mouth, his other arm wrapping around her waist, dragging her backward into the shadows between 2 SUVs. He was big, maybe 6'2" and 200 pounds of muscle, and he smelled like cigarettes and something chemical that made her eyes water. His voice was low and threatening when he spoke directly into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "You need to stop visiting that grave," he said, and there was no emotion in his words, just cold professionalism. "This is a message from someone who wants you to move on. Stop crying over dead men. Stop asking questions. Move on or face consequences." Imani's nursing training kicked in despite her terror, her brain cataloging details even as her body fought for survival. The slight Eastern European accent, the scar on his left hand, the fact that he knew about her cemetery visits, which meant someone had been watching her, tracking her, studying her routine. She twisted in his grip, drove her elbow back into his ribs, heard his grunt of pain and surprise. He released her mouth to grab her arm, and she screamed, loud enough to echo off the concrete walls, loud enough that someone had to hear. That's when she saw the knife, 6 inches of steel catching the flickering fluorescent light as he pulled it from his jacket. 3 miles away in his hidden facility, Elias Crane was watching the live feed from city traffic cameras that his team had hacked weeks ago specifically to monitor Imani's routes to and from her jobs. He saw the attack happen in real time and was on his feet before conscious thought caught up with instinct, his chair slamming backward into the wall behind him. Security team was already moving, Augustus's voice coming through the speaker system calm and professional in a way that made Elias want to scream. "Team is in vehicle, sir. 3 minutes out. Traffic is light. We'll make it in 2 minutes. 120 seconds. A lifetime when someone you love is fighting for survival in a parking garage with a man who has a knife and no conscience." Elias watched Imani fight back, watched her use every self-defense technique she'd probably learned from YouTube videos and late-night worry about walking home alone, watched her land a kick that made the attacker stumble backward. But he was trained and she wasn't, and within seconds he had her pressed against a car, the knife at her throat, his voice too low for the traffic cameras to pick up, but his message clear from his body language. His horror was visceral and complete, making his chest tight and his hands shake as he gripped the edge of his desk. She was bleeding from somewhere. He could see the dark stain spreading on her shirt, could see her face pale even through the grainy camera footage. The internal battle that raged in his head lasted maybe 5 seconds, but felt like an eternity. He could blow his cover right now, could call 911 from his phone, could give his real name and demand immediate police response, could end this nightmare of watching from the shadows. But that would expose everything, would alert Preston and Vivian and Dorothy that he was alive, would give them time to destroy evidence and flee and escape justice. Or he could trust his team, could believe in the professionals he'd hired specifically for situations like this, could maintain his cover for just 2 more minutes. His phone was in his hand, 911 already dialed, his finger hovering over the call button while his eyes stayed locked on the screen that showed Imani on the ground now, the attacker standing over her, raising the knife. The security team's arrival was so perfectly timed and professionally executed that it would have been beautiful if the situation hadn't been so terrifying. The unmarked black vehicle screeched into the parking garage at exactly 1 minute 47 seconds, and 3 men in tactical gear emerged before the car had fully stopped. The attacker saw them and ran, his survival instinct overriding whatever Preston had paid him to complete this job, and he disappeared up the stairwell while 1 team member pursued and the other 2 rushed to Imani's side. She was conscious but in shock, her hand pressed against a shallow cut on her arm that was bleeding more than it should, her eyes wide with fear and confusion and adrenaline. The team member who knelt beside her had kind eyes and a gentle voice, the kind of professional calm that comes from years of military or police work. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, already pulling medical supplies from a kit on his belt. "We're building security. We saw what happened on our cameras and got here as fast as we could." Imani's confusion was evident even through her shock, her nurse brain processing details that didn't quite add up. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "This building doesn't have armed security. I've worked here for 2 weeks, and there's just one guard at the front desk who's 70 years old and half deaf." The team member's lie was smooth and practiced, his hand steady as he applied pressure to her wound. "Enhanced security was hired last week after a series of break-ins in the area. We patrol multiple buildings in this district." The explanation was plausible enough that she didn't push, especially when the police arrived 4 minutes later with sirens, blaring, and questions that needed answers. The report was filed with efficient professionalism, the attacker's description given in detail, the security team's intervention praised by officers who bought their story without question. But Imani's suspicion was growing, a seed of doubt planted that would grow into full understanding within hours. This was too convenient, too professional, too perfectly timed to be coincidence. Ramona found her 2 hours later at a different hospital, not St. Michael's, where Imani had lost her job, but a smaller facility across town where she wouldn't have to face former coworkers who thought she was a thief. The cut on her arm had required 8 stitches, and she had bruises forming on her ribs and neck that would turn spectacular shades of purple by morning. Ramona burst through the emergency room curtain with her hair still in the messy bun she wore to sleep and fear written across her face. "What happened?" she demanded, pulling a chair close to the exam table and taking Imani's uninjured hand in both of hers. "You texted me one word, attacked, and then nothing for 2 hours. I've been losing my mind." The breaking happened slowly, and then all at once, Imani's careful control crumbling as she tried to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "Someone wanted me scared," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion and shock. "A man attacked me in the parking garage. He told me to stop visiting Elias's grave. He told me to move on or face consequences." Ramona's confusion mirrored her own. "But why? He's dead. Han, what does it matter if you visit his grave?" And that's when Imani voiced the suspicion that had been building since the moment the security team had arrived with their too convenient timing and their too smooth lies. "Unless this is about Elias," she said slowly, her brain working through possibilities that seemed insane but felt true. "His family hated me from the beginning. His sister looked at me like I was dirt on her expensive shoes. His business partner never wanted me around. What if they're afraid I know something?" The truth was she didn't know anything, had no evidence of any wrongdoing, had no information that could hurt anyone. But fear was planting seeds of understanding in soil that had been prepared by 3 months of watching Preston's barely concealed satisfaction, and Vivian's cold efficiency, and Dorothy's complete lack of genuine grief. "What if his death wasn't natural?" she whispered, and saying the words out loud made them feel terrifyingly possible. "What if they killed him, and they think I know something that could expose them?" Elias's decision was made before the sun rose the next morning, his voice steady and absolute when he gave Augustus the order they'd both known was coming. "Do it," he said simply. "Coordinate with the police. I want Preston, Vivian, and Dorothy arrested simultaneously. I want maximum visibility, and 0 chance for any of them to warn the others or destroy evidence." The raid was executed with military precision at 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 separate teams, moving on 3 separate locations at exactly the same moment. Preston was arrested at his penthouse still in his pajamas, handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists while he screamed about lawyers and false accusations and defamation. Vivian was taken into custody at her morning yoga class, pulled off her mat in front of 24 witnesses who recorded everything on their phones. Dorothy was arrested at her country club during breakfast, the indignity of being escorted out past her social circle in handcuffs, more painful to her than any prison sentence. The charges read like a crime novel: embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, fraud, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other felonies that carried sentences measured in decades, not years. The evidence was overwhelming, presented to the media in a press conference that dominated every news cycle. But the real bombshell came when the assistant district attorney revealed that Elias Crane hadn't actually died 3 months ago, that he'd been forced into hiding by his family's murder plot, that he'd faked his death to gather evidence that would put them away forever. The headline that appeared on every screen in America within minutes was simple and devastating. Billionaire fakes death to expose family's crimes. Imani was watching the news at Ramona's apartment because she couldn't face going back to her own place, was drinking coffee she couldn't taste while her friend scrolled through her phone reading updates out loud. The photo of Elias appeared on the television screen, recent and alive and looking nothing like a dead man, and the world stopped spinning for just a second. Her whispered question was barely audible over the reporter's voice. "He's alive!" Her phone rang before the shock could fully settle, an unknown number that she almost didn't answer until she saw it was from a law office. Augustus Lyle's voice was professional and kind when he spoke. "Ms. Okafor, my name is Augustus Lyle and I represent Elias Crane. We need to meet as soon as possible. Mr. Crane left very specific instructions regarding you, and there are things you need to know before you see him. Things about the last 3 months that will be difficult to hear, but that you deserve to understand." She was about to learn the truth about his surveillance, about the cameras that had watched her cry every Sunday for 13 weeks, about the anonymous payments that had saved her from homelessness, about the protection that had kept Preston's hired killers from succeeding. She was going to learn that the man she'd mourned had been watching her mourn, had been documenting her grief, had been choosing evidence over her suffering for 3 months of careful planning. And she was going to have to decide if that was betrayal or devotion, if his protection justified his deception, if love that watches from the shadows is still love at all. This is the moment the entire story has been building to. If you're still not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller, I honestly can't help you. You're actively choosing to miss the resolution of a story you've invested an hour in. Hit subscribe or explain yourself in the comments. I'll be reading them. Augustus Lyle's law office was nothing like Imani expected, located in a modest building in a middle-class neighborhood instead of the gleaming downtown high-rise she'd imagined a billionaire's attorney would occupy. The man himself was in his late 60s, a distinguished black attorney with silver hair and kind eyes that had probably seen every variation of human tragedy and triumph, and he gestured for her to sit across from his desk with the sort of gentle professionalism that told her he understood this meeting was going to hurt. The documents were already spread across the polished wood surface, organized in neat stacks that represented 3 months of surveillance, protection, and decisions made without her knowledge or consent. Imani's hands shook as she picked up the first page, her nursing training making her read clinical documentation, even when her heart was screaming at her to stop. Subject: Imani Okafor. Surveillance began, date of simulated death. Purpose: protection and evidence gathering. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, the words catching in her throat. "He was watching me." Augustus's explanation was careful and measured, delivered with the practiced care of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation since the day Elias had hired him. "He was protecting you, Ms. Okafor. Everything he did, every camera he placed, every security team he hired, every anonymous payment he made, it was all to keep you alive." He slid another document across the desk, this one containing video stills from the parking garage attack, time-stamped and annotated with details that made her stomach turn. The thug who'd attacked her 3 nights ago was named Viktor Petrov, a professional enforcer with connections to organized crime, and he'd been hired by Preston Ashford with explicit instructions to make her disappear permanently. The anonymous payments that had saved her from eviction, cleared her name with the nursing board, and funded Malik's scholarship, all of them had come from accounts Elias had set up specifically for her protection, untraceable but undeniable in their origin once you had access to the right financial records. Her anger built slowly at first, and then all at once, a wave of fury that felt cleaner and simpler than the complicated mess of emotions churning in her chest. "He let me grieve," she said, her voice rising with each word. "He watched me cry every Sunday for 13 weeks. He watched me lose my job, my apartment, my entire life, and he did nothing." Augustus didn't flinch from her anger, didn't try to minimize or excuse what Elias had done. "He watched you being yourself," the attorney said quietly. "He watched you show up every week when his family stopped coming after one visit. He saw who really cared about him, who really loved him, and who was celebrating his death. The revelation came next, delivered with the kind of calm that made the words hit even harder. Preston and Vivian had planned to kill Imani within 2 weeks of the funeral, had hired Viktor Petrov and had a disposal plan ready, had decided she was a loose end that needed eliminating even though she knew nothing about their crimes. Elias's protection detail had been the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave in the woods outside the city, 24-hour surveillance, and armed response teams ready to intervene at any sign of danger. Her processing of this information happened in stages, fury mixing with understanding, mixing with a new kind of terror about how close she'd come to dying without ever knowing she was in danger. "So I was part of his plan?" she asked, her voice breaking on the question. "Evidence? Bait? What was I to him?" Augustus shook his head firmly, his expression softening in a way that told her this was the truth Elias had most wanted her to understand. "No, Ms. Okafor. You were never part of the plan. You were the reason he survived it. The video evidence was harder to watch than any medical procedure she'd ever assisted with, harder than watching patients die, harder than anything she'd experienced in her 28 years of life." Augustus played the footage from Elias's hidden facility, showing her what she'd never been meant to see. The surveillance room with its wall of monitors, the cameras trained on Greystone Cemetery, and Elias's face as he watched her Sunday visits. His anguish was visible even through the digital recording. The way his hands gripped the armrests, the way his jaw clenched when she cried, the way his whole body seemed to collapse in on itself when she told the grave about losing her job. There was a timestamp from the day she'd been fired, showing Elias breaking down completely, his fists slamming the desk so hard the monitors shook. The audio recording that accompanied it was crystal clear, his voice raw and broken in a way she'd never heard from him even in the hospital when he was dying. "I can't do this to her anymore," he said to Augustus in that recording. "I can't keep watching her suffer. End it now. Arrest them now. I don't care if we have every piece of evidence. She matters more than justice." Augustus had talked him into waiting just 48 more hours, had convinced him that exposing the conspiracy too early would put her in even more danger, and Elias had agreed, but only barely. Then came the letter, handwritten on expensive stationery in Elias's distinctive script, and Augustus read it aloud because Imani's eyes were too blurred with tears to make out the words. "Imani, you deserved better than my world. I wanted to give you that. A life without my family's poison, without Preston's corruption, without the danger that comes from being close to someone like me. I thought if I could remove myself from your life, if I could disappear and take all the danger with me, you could finally be happy and safe and free." His words continued, each sentence feeling like a knife between her ribs. "But watching you live in my world, watching you grieve and suffer and lose everything because of choices I made, broke me more than any poison they put in my body. I'm sorry. God, Imani, I'm so sorry. I love you. I've always loved you. And I'll understand if you hate me forever." Imani sat in that office chair trying to parse emotions that seemed contradictory and irreconcilable, trying to separate her fury at his deception from her understanding of his motivation, trying to decide if protection that looked like abandonment was still protection at all. Augustus waited patiently, his hands folded on his desk, giving her the time and space she needed to process everything she'd learned. Finally, he spoke the question she'd been dreading. "He wants to see you, Miss Okafor. If you're willing." Her own question came immediately, the thing that had been bothering her since the moment she'd learned he was alive. Why didn't he just tell me the plan? Why didn't he trust me enough to let me help? Augustus's answer was gentle but firm, delivered with the authority of someone who'd spent 3 months watching this tragedy unfold. Because he needed to see who mourned him and who celebrated his death. He needed evidence of his family's true nature. But more importantly, he needed you safe, and they would have used you against him if they'd known you were involved. They would have hurt you to control him, or killed you to hurt him, and he couldn't risk that. Her realization came slowly, the pieces finally clicking together into a picture that was both beautiful and terrible. "So he let me suffer to keep me alive." Augustus's response was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. "He suffered more watching you suffer, Ms. Okafor. Every day. Every single day." Her decision wasn't immediate, wasn't the dramatic declaration that movies had taught her love should be. I need time, she said quietly, standing on legs that felt unsteady. Augustus nodded like he'd expected this, pulled a key from his desk drawer, and handed it to her along with an address written on expensive cardstock. Whenever you're ready, he said simply. He'll be waiting. He's been waiting for 3 months. He can wait as long as you need. The internal debate consumed Imani for 3 days, during which she barely slept and couldn't eat, and drove both Malik and Ramona to the edge of their patience with her endless circular reasoning. Malik's input was simple and absolute, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd grown up watching his sister sacrifice everything for other people. He protected you, her brother said, sitting across from her at their kitchen table. He could have told you and put you in danger, or he could have kept you safe and let you hate him. He chose your life over your love. That's what love actually looks like. But Ramona's perspective was equally valid, delivered with the fierce loyalty of someone who'd watched her best friend fall apart for 3 months. He lied to you, she said, pacing Imani's small living room. He watched you grieve and suffer and lose everything, and he could have stopped it at any time. That's betrayal, no matter how you dress it up. That's playing God with someone else's life. Imani listened to both of them and knew they were both right, knew this wasn't a situation with a clear answer or an obvious path forward. On the 3rd day, she went to Greystone Cemetery one more time, needing closure, or maybe permission, or maybe just one last conversation with the version of Elias who existed in her memory before reality complicated everything. She knelt in the dirt beside his grave, placed the daisy she bought with money he'd anonymously given her, and spoke to the headstone like she'd done 13 times before. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said honestly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I don't know if watching me grieve was devotion or cruelty or some complicated thing that's both. But I need to see you. I need to hear you explain it in your own words. I need to know if the man I loved is the same man who watched me suffer for 3 months. The decision made, she drove to the address Augustus had given her, an industrial area on the outskirts of a city where warehouses sat empty and security cameras tracked her progress. The facility was unmarked and unremarkable from the outside, but security personnel led her through multiple checkpoints without question, their faces telling her they'd been expecting her, that they knew exactly who she was. The elevator descended rather than climbed, taking her underground to a place that shouldn't exist, and her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The doors opened to the surveillance room she'd seen in the video footage, all those monitors still displaying feeds from around the city, still showing Greystone Cemetery where her daisies sat on an empty grave. The room was empty at first, and she took 3 steps inside before she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find him standing there, alive and real and nothing like a ghost. His first words in 3 months were simple and devastating. Hi, Imani. Her slap caught him across the face with enough force to turn his head, her hand moving before her brain could authorize the action. 3 months of grief and fury and betrayal channeled into that single point of contact. And then she kissed him, grabbed his shirt, and pulled him down to her and kissed him like she was trying to prove he was real, like she was punishing him and forgiving him and claiming him all at once. What happens when a love story is built on grief and lies? When protection feels like betrayal and devotion looks like cruelty? When the man you mourned was watching you cry the whole time? They were about to find out. We're 2 chapters from the end, and if you still haven't subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller, I'm genuinely baffled. What are you doing? Hit that button now, or accept that you're the person who watches entire movies and walks out before the ending. Comment and explain yourself. The kiss broke after what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, and Imani pulled back with tears streaming down her face and fury blazing in her eyes, her hand still fisted in his shirt like she was afraid he'd disappear again if she let go. The raw honesty that followed was brutal and necessary. 3 months of grief and lies stripped away until there was nothing left but 2 people who'd hurt each other trying to survive impossible circumstances. Her fury came first, sharp and cutting. You watched me lose everything, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. My job, my apartment, my reputation, my sense of self. You watched it all fall apart and you did nothing. His defense was immediate but not defensive, his voice steady despite the red mark her slap had left on his face. I watched them try to destroy you and I stopped it, he said, taking a step closer until they were almost touching. Every single day, I watched Preston and Vivian plan new ways to hurt you, and every single day I made sure those plans failed. You're alive because I was watching. You're standing here because I protected you even when you didn't know you needed protecting." Her response was the question that had been eating at her since Augustus's office. "You could have told me. You could have trusted me with the truth instead of letting me think you were dead." His answer came with evidence he'd been keeping ready for this exact conversation. A tablet he pulled from the desk showing 18 separate documented threats against her life, each one dated and detailed with a kind of specificity that made her stomach turn. "They would have killed you," he said simply. "If you'd known I was alive, if you'd tried to help me or contact me or done anything other than grieve publicly, Preston would have had you murdered within a week. Your ignorance was the only thing keeping you safe." She processed this information in stages, her nurse's brain cataloging facts while her heart tried to reconcile protection with control, safety with autonomy, love with deception. His vulnerability came next, the raw admission he'd been holding back. "I couldn't lose you for real," he whispered, and his voice broke on the words. "Losing you to grief was torture, but losing you to a bullet or a knife or a staged accident because I'd been selfish enough to tell you the truth, that would have destroyed me completely." Their conversation stretched over hours, the surveillance room around them forgotten, as they worked through 3 months of accumulated pain and misunderstanding. They cried, both of them, tears that had been building since that morning in the hospital when his heart had stopped and hers had broken. They shouted, voices rising with anger that was justified and necessary and ultimately cathartic. And slowly, painfully, they began to understand each other in ways they hadn't before. His confession came in fragments, delivered between apologies and explanations. "Watching you grieve almost destroyed me," he admitted, sitting on the floor because his legs couldn't hold him anymore. "Every Sunday, I wanted to run to that cemetery. I wanted to drop to my knees in front of you and beg forgiveness. I wanted to tell you I was alive and hold you and promise never to hurt you again." He described what it had been like watching her lose her job, watching the false accusations spread through the hospital, watching her walk out with her head held high despite the shame and confusion. He told her about the night she cried on her bathroom floor while Malik held her, how he'd broken down completely in his hidden facility and had almost blown the entire operation just to make her pain stop. Her own confession surprised them both, delivered quietly while she sat beside him on the cold concrete floor. "I knew you weren't really gone," she said, and his head snapped toward her in shock. "Not consciously, maybe, but in my heart, I felt you watching. I felt you present in a way that dead people aren't." His voice was barely a whisper. "You knew." She shook her head, clarifying. "I suspected. Deep down, in places I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew something wasn't right. The timing of the anonymous payments was too convenient. The security team that saved me appeared too quickly. You always protected me, even when I didn't ask for it, even when I didn't want it. Why would death change that?" The moment of truth hung between them, heavy with possibility and fear. "So what now?" she asked, and the question contained multitudes. The trial happened 3 weeks later, enough time for prosecutors to organize the overwhelming amount of evidence into a case that was airtight and damning. The courthouse was packed with media and spectators, everyone wanting to witness the downfall of a family that had represented everything wrong with wealth and privilege and unchecked power. Preston Ashford sat at the defense table looking smaller than he'd ever looked in life, his expensive suit unable to hide the reality of what he was, a criminal facing consequences he thought his money could prevent. Vivian maintained her composure until the embezzlement evidence was presented, until the jury saw exactly how she'd helped Preston steal from her own brother and had celebrated his supposed death. Dorothy sat stone-faced through the entire proceeding, her pearls perfect and her spine straight, refusing to show remorse or shame or any human emotion that might have made the jury see her as anything other than a monster in designer clothing. Elias testified for 6 hours over 2 days, walking the jury through the poisoning evidence, explaining how the slow-acting toxin had been administered through his vitamin supplements, describing the symptoms that had nearly killed him and the investigation that had saved his life and destroyed his family. His voice never wavered, his testimony never faltered, and when he described watching his own funeral via hidden cameras, The courtroom went completely silent. Imani testified about the attack in the parking garage, about losing her job to fabricated accusations, about the systematic destruction of her life orchestrated by people who saw her as nothing more than a loose end to be eliminated. Her dignity under cross-examination was remarkable, her refusal to be shaken or intimidated making even the defense attorneys respect her despite themselves. The verdicts came after 3 days of deliberation. Preston Ashford, 25 years for attempted murder, embezzlement, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges that would keep him in prison until he was elderly and broken. Vivian Crane, 15 years for conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder, her elegant life reduced to a cell and a jumpsuit, and the knowledge that her greed had cost her everything. Dorothy Crane, 10 years for her complicity, lighter than her children's sentences but still enough to ensure she die either in prison or shortly after release, her country club memberships and social standing nothing but memories. The courtroom erupted when the final verdict was read, but Elias's face showed no satisfaction, just exhaustion, and the kind of emptiness that comes from winning a war you never wanted to fight. Imani's hand found his under the table, her fingers interlacing with his in silent support that said more than words ever could. The media frenzy outside the courthouse was chaos incarnate, reporters shoving microphones and cameras into every available space, security struggling to create a path through the crowd. The questions came rapid fire from all directions, but one voice cut through the noise with a question everyone wanted answered. "Mr. Crane, what's next for you?" He stopped walking, turned to face the cameras, and his answer came while looking directly at Imani standing beside him. "Living for the right reasons," he said, his voice clear and steady despite the chaos. "For the right person." Her tears were immediate and unstoppable, but these were the first happy tears she'd cried in months, the first tears that weren't grief or loss or despair. His public statement came next, delivered with the kind of raw honesty that would make headlines for weeks and would eventually become the basis for 3 different documentaries about his case. "This woman kept me alive when I had nothing," he said, gesturing to Imani while the cameras captured every word. 3 years ago, I was worth $800 million and trusted no one. She was a night shift nurse drowning in debt who looked at me like I was a person instead of a bank account. She became my best friend. She fell in love with me when I was dead, visited my grave every week, brought flowers she couldn't afford, and cried for a man who didn't deserve her tears. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved me when I was dead. Imagine what we can build now that I'm alive." 1 week later, they returned to Greystone Cemetery together, walking hand in hand past rows of graves until they reached the marble headstone that still bore Elias Nathaniel Crane's name and dates that were now provably false. Standing at his own grave should have felt surreal or darkly comic, but mostly it just felt necessary, like they couldn't move forward until they'd properly said goodbye to the past 3 months and everything those months had cost them both. Imani's question was practical and symbolic at once. "Do we take down the headstone?" Elias considered the question seriously, his eyes tracing the carved letters that announced his death to anyone who passed. "Leave it," he finally decided. "Let it be a reminder of who I was, the man who thought he could control everything, who thought protection meant isolation, who nearly lost the only real thing in his life because he was too afraid to trust." He turned to face her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been even before his fake death. "And who I don't want to be anymore." Imani knelt one last time, placing daisies at the base of the headstone with the kind of ceremony that marked endings and beginnings. "Goodbye to the ghost," she said softly, her fingers trailing over the cold marble. Elias's arm came around her shoulders, warm and solid and undeniably alive. "Hello to the future," he responded, and there was hope in his voice for the first time in months. His question came quietly, the one he'd been afraid to ask. "Can you forgive me?" Her answer was honest and complicated and exactly what he needed to hear. "I'm working on it," she said, standing and turning into his embrace. "Ask me again in a year." She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "Or 10, or 50. His smile was the first genuine one anyone had seen from him in months, maybe years, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. They walked away from the grave together, leaving behind the daisies and the lies and the version of themselves that had died and been reborn through fire. But forgiveness is just the beginning, just the first step in rebuilding something that was broken before it ever had a chance to be whole. Love rebuilt from ashes is either unbreakable or destined to burn again, stronger the second time or consumed completely by its own intensity. Their story isn't over. It's just starting. One chapter left. One. And you're still not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller? At this point, I'm not even asking. I'm just confused about your life choices. Hit subscribe, or live with eternal regret. Drop a comment with your excuse if you're still resisting. 1 year after Elias Crane walked away from his own grave with Imani Okafor's hand in his, the world looked fundamentally different for both of them in ways that had nothing to do with money or headlines or the media circus that had eventually died down when the next scandal captured public attention. Imani sat in her new office at St. Michael's Hospital, the same hospital that had fired her 13 months earlier, but this time she occupied a corner space with windows that overlooked the city, and a title that reflected years of experience and hard-won wisdom. Director of Patient Advocacy, the placard on her door read, heading a program funded entirely by Elias's foundation, which he'd renamed the Real Care Initiative in honor of the night shift nurse who'd once brought him terrible vending machine coffee and honest conversation. Her office was professional without being ostentatious, decorated with photos of patients she'd helped and thank you cards from families who'd navigated impossible medical situations with her guidance. The nursing board had reinstated her license with a formal apology that had been as close to groveling as institutional bureaucracy allowed, complete with a note about investigating the administrators who'd been bribed by Preston to fire her in the first place. Her career had been rebuilt stronger than before, founded on competence that no one could question and respect that had been earned through surviving attempts to destroy her. Malik was in his senior year at university, on a full scholarship that was now openly attributed to the Real Care Initiative, studying to become a social worker because he'd spent his formative years watching his sister fight systems that were designed to crush people who couldn't afford to fight back. Ramona had been promoted to head nurse in the emergency department and was still Imani's best friend, still the person who brought her coffee during long days and told her uncomfortable truths when she needed to hear them. Elias's transformation had been equally profound but far more painful, requiring him to dismantle everything he'd built and reconstruct it according to principles he should have followed from the beginning. His company had been restructured from the ground up with ethical leadership that prioritized worker welfare over profit margins, environmental sustainability over quarterly earnings, and long-term community investment over short-term shareholder returns. Preston's replacement had been promoted from within, a woman who'd started in customer service and had worked her way up through merit and competence rather than connections and manipulation. The company's new mission statement, written by Elias himself, focused on healthcare accessibility and worker protections, using technology to solve problems rather than exploit vulnerabilities. He'd spent months in therapy learning to trust again, learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and that asking for help didn't make him less capable. The work was ongoing, and probably would be for the rest of his life, but he showed up for it the same way he showed up for everything else now, with honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable and always necessary. His relationship with his mother had been severed completely, a decision he'd made after she'd written him from prison asking for financial support and showing not a single ounce of remorse for trying to have him killed. Dorothy had chosen greed over her son, and Elias had chosen to build a new family from people who'd chosen him back. That family included Imani and Malik, Ramona, who'd become a fierce protective presence in his life, and Augustus the attorney, who'd become something close to a father figure. Found family, he learned, was often stronger than blood because it was built on choice rather than obligation. Their relationship had been rebuilt slowly and deliberately, with none of the grand romantic gestures that movies had taught them love should look like, but with all the quiet consistency that actually made relationships survive. Wednesday night coffee had been restored as their sacred ritual, that same diner with its scratched vinyl booze and coffee that was still terrible but somehow tasted like home. They argued sometimes, usually about his tendency toward overprotectiveness and her fierce independence that wouldn't bend even when bending might be easier. He was learning to ask instead of assume, to offer help rather than impose solutions, to respect her autonomy, even when every instinct screamed at him to protect her from every possible harm. She was learning to let him in, to accept help without seeing it as weakness, to understand that his protection came from love rather than control. Their love was deepening through honestly earned trust, through showing up day after day even when it was hard, through choosing each other repeatedly instead of assuming choice was a one-time event. It wasn't perfect because nothing real ever is, but it was authentic in a way that made perfection seem shallow and insufficient by comparison. They had fights that got heated in days when they annoyed each other and moments when old wounds reopened unexpectedly, but they worked through all of it with the kind of commitment that only comes from knowing exactly how much you could lose. The anniversary of his fake death fell on a Sunday, which seemed fitting given that Sundays had become their day in a different way now. They drove to Greystone Cemetery together, parking in the spot where Imani used to leave her car before taking 2 buses because she couldn't afford gas, and walked hand in hand to the grave that still bore his name in false dates. The ritual had transformed over the past year from something painful to something almost peaceful, a way of honoring what they'd survived rather than mourning what they'd lost. They both placed daisies at the base of the headstone, their hands working in sync, and Elias broke the solemn moment with the kind of gentle humor that had become his way of showing love. "Still your favorite flower?" he asked, nudging her shoulder with his. Her smile was immediate and genuine, the kind that reached her eyes and made her whole face light up. "They're stubborn, survive anything, keep blooming even when conditions are terrible," she said, her tone making it clear she was talking about more than flowers. "They remind me of us." The cemetery guard who'd befriended Imani during those lonely Sunday visits approached them with his characteristic kindness, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You two figured it out," he said, and it wasn't a question. Their laughter was shared and easy, the kind that comes from knowing you've survived something that should have destroyed you. "Yes," Imani confirmed, squeezing Elias's hand. "Painfully, slowly, with a lot of therapy and a few screaming matches, but yes." They walked through the cemetery together, past rows of graves that represented other people's losses and grief, their conversation turning to lighter topics and shared memories. His question came casually but carried weight they both understood. "Any regrets?" Her answer was characteristically honest, the kind of complicated truth that their relationship had been built on. "About trusting you? No. About falling in love with you? Never. About those 3 months when I thought you were dead and my whole world was falling apart." She paused, considering her words carefully. "Always. I'll always regret that pain. Always wish it could have happened differently. But I understand why it happened the way it did. And I'm here now. We're both here now. That's what matters." The final scene of their story, or at least this portion of it, happened at sunset in their favorite diner, the one where everything had started 3 years ago when a billionaire had decided to meet a nurse as an equal rather than a charity case. The coffee was still terrible, the vinyl booths were still cracked, and the normalcy of it all was a choice they'd made deliberately, a rejection of the expensive restaurants and exclusive events that Elias's wealth could have bought them. This was real, this was them, and this was enough. His confession came over refills that the waitress had long since stopped charging them for, his nervous energy visible in the way he kept adjusting his coffee cup and avoiding her eyes. "I have something to ask you," he started, and Imani's immediate nervousness made her tense. "Elias," she began, but he cut her off gently. "Do you trust me?" The question hung between them, loaded with history and weight and the memory of 3 months when trust had been tested and broken, and slowly, painfully rebuilt. Her answer came after a moment of genuine consideration, because she'd learned that honesty mattered more than easy comfort. "I'm learning to. Every day, I trust you a little more. Every day, you show me I'm right to trust you." His smile was nervous, almost boyish, so different from the polished businessman who'd walked into St. Michael's emergency room 3 years ago. "Good. Because I'm terrified." Her confusion was evident. "Of what?" His answer was raw and vulnerable, the kind of admission that cost him something to make. "Of losing you again. Of messing this up. Of doing something that makes you walk away and realizing too late that I've destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Her response was immediate and tinged with the humor that had become their way of healing old wounds. "Then don't fake your death again. Simple rule. Maybe write it down if you need a reminder." Their laughter filled the diner, drawing fond looks from the waitress and the handful of other patrons who'd witnessed their reunion over the past year and had invested themselves in the outcome of this improbable love story. His hand covered hers on the scarred table, his touch warm and steady and present. "I love you," he said, and the simplicity of the words made them more powerful than any elaborate declaration. The real me loves the real you. Not the version of me who thought money could solve everything, or the version of you who thought she had to do everything alone. Just us. Just this. Her answer came through tears that were happy and healing, through a smile that had taken a year to feel natural again. "I love you too, even when you're an idiot, especially when you're an idiot, because at least then I know you're being honest." The final image of their story is this. Two people who survived betrayal and grief and lies and their own worst instincts, who came through fire and chose not to let it consume them, who learned that love isn't about perfection or grand gestures or surveillance rooms and protection details. It's about showing up every day and choosing each other repeatedly, about Wednesday night coffee and terrible diner food and honest conversations that sometimes hurt but always matter. It's about daisies on a grave that marks a death that never happened and a life that almost ended but didn't. They're still choosing each other, will keep choosing each other tomorrow and next week and next year, for as long as choice remains possible and love remains real. No more graves, no more ghosts, no more surveillance cameras watching from the shadows. Just two people who learn the hard way that love earned through fire is the kind that lasts forever, that trust rebuilt is stronger than trust that was never tested, that sometimes you have to lose everything to learn what actually matters. Just love, real and messy and complicated and absolutely worth every single moment of pain it took to get here. That's the end of a story, but if you're not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller, you're going to miss dozens more just like it. This is your absolute last chance. Hit that subscribe button right now. And if you're still not going to do it, I need you to comment below and explain what's wrong with you. I'm serious. I want to understand the psychology of someone who watches an entire hour-long story and then chooses not to subscribe. Enlighten me. Everyone else, welcome to the family. See you in the next story.